Today's video, what I want to do is that I want to share with you guys a series of anecdotes and interesting tidbits of information from either very old traditional Japanese books that I've read or anecdotes from actual masters that I know that I've shared with or people that they knew. I've got about 12 items that I want to share that I think are pretty cool to know about. And let's actually start with a pretty interesting slash funny one, which is usually when tattooers start learning how to tattoo, whether they're Japanese or Western or from wherever, whether it's tebori, the handbook method, or machine, they will practice on themselves, right? Usually they'll practice on their legs or they'll practice somewhere else or they'll practice on their friends. That's pretty common all around the world. An interesting anecdote that I heard from very old masters is that they would practice tebori, the handbook method, on radishes. So that's how they would practice their technique. Eventually, of course, they would graduate, so to speak, to tattooing themselves or tattooing others, but they would actually practice their tebori technique on radishes. The second sort of informational bit is around ink composition. In the past, inks were actually quite dangerous. The color palette was traditionally black, gray, and then you had this vermilion-like color called shu. And this shu was typically composed of very poisonous materials to the human body. So whether they be cadmium or mercury or whatever, so that when people got tattoos, they would get fevers, whether it was that very same night or throughout a prolonged period, because of these poisonous materials in their body. So this shu color in particular, the vermilion color, was known to sort of show that, oh, you're a very tough person because it just affected you so much. Similarly, something that I heard from, let's call him a more contemporary master, even though he is of age, is that he would use Listerine, like the actual mouthwash product, Listerine, in his, let's just call it ink composition, right? That sounded very interesting. I personally wouldn't want to be tattooed with Listerine, but of course, all due respect to him, I don't recommend it. Obviously, inks are a very complex topic. I'm not going to give any recommendations in here, specifically not medical or anything along those lines. But, well, he did it, right? And all the tattoos came out great, which is pretty interesting. One thing that probably not a lot of people know is that there used to be a lot of collaboration in tattoo composition. So there might be a tattooer who was renowned for making fantastic designs, like the outlines and such. And so somebody would get the outline tattooed by that person. And then they would get the shading or the actual color from somebody else, right? I don't think that's something that happens very often nowadays, but certainly wasn't uncommon in the past. And so it's interesting to know that there was this collaboration between masters of their specific, let's just call it subcraft, and there would be no issues with it, right? There would be no egos or anything along those lines. It would be, hey, let's just get the best tattoo possible. One thing that many people learning about traditional Japanese tattooing nowadays might think about is the Kansai versus Kanto styles, right? It usually has to do with the mikiri and how long the tattoo is, specifically, let's say, for example, in the chest area, right? They would call it Kansai bori, Kanto bori. And at one point in time, there was that distinction, right? In Kansai, the tattoo would go pretty much over the whole chest, whereas the Kanto style would go above a certain threshold, usually the nipples. But nowadays, that distinction really doesn't exist, right? People in, whether it's in Kansai or in Kanto, they'll get all sorts of tattoos, all sorts of different lengths. It's just whatever looks best for their particular body, which honestly is what makes the most sense. You want to get something that looks great on you. So really, even though in the past there might have been a distinction between Kansai style and Kanto style, at least in the way that it's usually portrayed, that's not the case anymore. Of course, I'm sure there are still peculiarities, especially between specific tattooers, that might be true. But that whole, length of the tattoo, that's just not applicable really anymore. Some notes on the outlaw side of the equation would be that this is true even still today, that, let's say, society members might get their family crests tattooed in their bodies as a sign of affiliation, right? So, for example, if you look at some Instagram posts nowadays and you see a very big emblem blurred out, then typically, not always, of course, but typically what it means is, oh, okay, that's the family crest. That's the association with a specific society. So that was very popular back then. That's still very much popular today. On this same topic, it used to be very common in the past that organizations would have tattooers sort of travel around Japan to tattoo members of their organization, right? So I would read or hear from multiple Orishi or traditional Japanese tattooers how they would be invited to these different places, sometimes pretty luxurious type of settings. We're at a very nice hotel or with a lot of food and whatever, and they would tattoo members of the organization, sometimes in some pretty interesting locations like abandoned sites and such. But it used to be a thing. They would get these tattooers to travel across Japan to tattoo members of their organizations. And funny enough, from all the anecdotes that I've heard on this specific topic, they're all positive. Right? Nobody has ever said, oh, I had a bad time or whatever. They pretty much, whether it's I heard it or I read it, they pretty much had a pretty darn good time, right? You're being treated to many things, right? And all you have to do is do the thing you love. It's actually sounds like a pretty nice deal, right? Not that I condone any sort of criminal activity, of course. Usually people both in Japan and in the West, they will associate traditional Japanese tattoos with outlaws, with underworld societies, so to speak. But I've read and heard this from masters of the past and then also still masters of today that there really is a variety of clientele, right? From the blue collar worker, carpenters, firefighters, so on and so forth, to artists, authors, and such, businessmen, even politicians that get tattoos, right? In Japan, obviously, they don't flaunt them around, they don't show them around, but they still get those tattoos done because they have the appreciation for the craft. And that leads me to another point of these gatherings that are not uncommon in Japan, right? Whether it's a club, an association, or just a gathering of clients. It's not unusual for clients of a specific orishi to just get together and share, right? Share a meal, share some drinks, sing some karaoke. These sort of community bonding activities are not uncommon in Japan. I think they're actually pretty nice. They're pretty cool. They still happen today, and it'd be nice to actually also have it abroad, and whether it's in the West or wherever. Usually these type of gatherings are obviously, let's say, incognito. You don't really advertise them around, but there are old videos of specific Orishi and their clients just having a good time together, singing, drinking, eating. And even now, particularly today, you have advertisement and Instagram about all these conventions and gatherings and stuff. It used to be that you needed to be the clients of a specific Orishi, but nowadays you also have like a more open forum where people from different, let's say, backgrounds can just come together and share. And the more psychological / perception side of the house, you have this divide between Horishi. I'm not gonna call out any specific names, right? It can get a little bit controversial, but there are those who believe that traditional Japanese tattoo should only be done to outlaws and members of certain societies because that's the old culture, and more people getting them might dilute the old spirit and tradition. There are people in that bucket, but then of course there are people in other buckets, such as, hey, this is a beautiful thing, this is a craft, this is a way to express traditional Japanese culture in a beautiful way, right? Whether it's respecting tradition very strictly, or whether it's something more personal to each individual, but it's sort of a divide between outlaw culture and appreciation for the craft, regardless of your associations. But then, of course, there's no, let's say, discrimination, so to speak. And the people who have said, hey, this should be for outlaws only, they tattoo people who obviously are outlaws. And the people who say, hey, this is really a craft, a beautiful thing, they also do tattoo outlaws as well. So it's more of a perspective kind of thing, but it's not really a hard and fast rule that they just stick to. Now, speaking of perception, there's this curious phenomenon in Japan where traditional Japanese tattoos, given the long history, of course, of this association, but they're associated with, again, outlaw groups. And it doesn't matter who you are. You have Wabori, you have Horimono, they instantaneously think you're a little bit scarier because you might be a society member or whatever. Versus if you have a Western type of tattoo, they might think it's a little bit more fashion statement, cuter or whatever, right? But not as heavy in meaning as traditional Japanese tattoos. I thought that was pretty interesting because that still happens today. And it's interesting because it doesn't really matter what you do, who you are. There's this instant labeling of, oh, you have traditional Japanese tattoos, you might be a little bit, more dangerous or whatever. Of course, that's not always the case. And lastly, what I want to share is more of a comment from my side rather than an anecdote or whatever. But I do find that traditional Japanese tattoos are such an incredible way to maintain traditional Japanese culture. Sure, they have society, associations, and a certain past or whatever, but still, when you get a traditional Japanese tattoos, you're getting folklore, you're getting tradition inked into your body, and you have some sort of understanding of what you're getting tattooed. And then the people who see that or the people you talk to about it, they get to learn about that. They get to maintain that knowledge, that tradition. So I find it to be a beautiful craft, a very culturally significant craft. And it's great to see that it seems to be reflourishing, so to speak, obviously abroad, and then also back in Japan as well. So having said all that, thank you for watching. There's many interesting interviews and content coming down the pipeline. So stay tuned and I'll see you next time.